It's traditionally set aside for those who suffered persecution by their government because they belong to a discriminated group because of political or religious beliefs or race or nationality. So asylum is not for those fleeing crime or poverty or any other privation. And in reality, asylum is achieved the moment a refugee crosses the first national boundary that separates them from the government that's persecuting them.
It has to be based on their race, their religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. So if things are just bad generally in your country, it doesn't mean you qualify for asylum. You need to be singled out. You have to have a well-grounded fear of persecution. The system of asylum was basically established after World War II. The St. Louis was a ship that was carrying Jews who were escaping from Germany. They were refused admittance. They returned to Europe, and most of the people in the ship perished in the concentration camps. And after World War II, most of the advanced nations adopted the asylum system to prevent that kind of thing from happening again.
The Supreme Court has said that the range of constitutional protections that aliens do depends on the alien's history in the United States and the alien's manner of entry. If an alien's in the U.S. and has filed an asylum application, they have a right to appear before either an immigration judge or an asylum officer who will determine the validity of the claim and whether it meets the legal standard to receive asylum. And these proceedings satisfy the concept of due process.
Whether you are an asylum seeker, whether you're an undocumented immigrant, whatever, has certain rights. For example, the due process clause in the Constitution says any person, right, is entitled to due process. And the First Amendment applies to, Congress shall make no law, and that applies to anybody who's here. But you don't have a right to stay necessarily until you're granted asylum. So yeah, you don't have full rights, of course.
Return first to their country of citizenship or nationality, if that's not possible, to their country of birth, and if that's not possible, to whatever country in which they have residence. And if none of those are available, they're deportable to any other country that will accept them.
Under the law, they can be returned to their country of origin or any other country that is willing to take them, that is a safe third country. That's the standard for removals. There is no asylum being the Trump administration, I think, in violation of the law, is no longer really adhering to the asylum provisions of immigration law. Having said that, in the prior administration, I mean, the system had completely broken down. There were too many people to adequately process the claims. You're supposed to get an initial credible fear analysis before you're admitted to the United States. The volume was such that people were entered in without the credible fear interview. Very large numbers, at some point a majority of those admitted actually were not eligible for asylum. Didn't make them bad people. They might have been escaping or trying to find a better life, but they were not legitimate asylees.
Millions of illegal migrants made fraudulent asylum claims. They were rewarded with admission into the country, free transportation to the city of their choice, free food, shelter, medical care, free legal representation, and after 6 months, a work authorization, while they waited for an immigration hearing that was set literally years into the future because of the sheer numbers involved. And once they were ordered deported, as the vast majority are, they were assured under the prior administration the government would not enforce that order. So we've got 1.4 million illegal migrants who made phony asylum claims that were found in a court to not be valid. The court ordered them deported, and yet they're still here.
The whole system broke down. I had urged the prior administration, to do pre-processing to avoid that off-border. And they did some pilot projects that worked in that regard, but they didn't take the full step and continued to allow the overwhelming of the system to occur. And I think that was a big mistake on their part.
Well, we need to restore our asylum laws for those that they were designed to protect, people who've been singled out by their government for persecution. It ought to be limited to those legally entering through our ports of entry, claiming asylum. It should be denied to those who pass through other countries where they could have and should have applied for asylum. Claimants should be detained until their case is heard, as the law requires, or allowed to wait in safe third countries. That would, again, remove the incentives to make fraudulent claims.
Well, the national security trumps anything else. I mean, you can't be admitted to the United States if you're a security threat to the United States, even if you are in fact fleeing persecution. You're not eligible if you're a security threat. So that's the state of the law, and that should not change.
Entering illegally or committing other crimes in this country ought to be automatic disqualifications. I think these reforms would discourage fraudulent claims, would reduce the backlog of claimants, and would restore our asylum system to those who have legitimate claims. It's not a question of being bigger or smaller. It's a question of confining the asylum process to legitimate claims. As I said, about 85% of those claims turn out to be fraudulent. Only about 15% are actually approved. So by rewarding illegal immigration and refusing to enforce our immigration laws, the Biden administration presided over an explosion of fraudulent claims, and that's completely overwhelmed our immigration system. You now have to wait many, many years just to have your claim heard, and that's not fair to the legitimate claimants for asylum.
The limitation isn't by number, it's by qualification. And I think there's no question that people were taking advantage of the asylum system who were not eligible for asylum. And that needed to be dealt with and could have been dealt with. And if there is a new Democratic president in 3.5 years, we're going to insist that it's dealt with in a successful way.
If we'd simply return to the traditional definition of asylum and conform our laws to that purpose and enforce those laws, we could preserve the system for every legitimate refugee seeking asylum by discouraging all of the frivolous claims.
Not having any asylum, I think, is not in keeping with our history or with the law. I mean, there are people who are legitimately seeking protection, and the civilized nations of the world provide that protection. That ought to be our guide.